I was sitting on my couch, the termination slip a crumpled ball on the coffee table when the windows rattled. It wasn't a loud noise, just a deep, distant thump, like the world had dropped something heavy. I didn't know it yet, but that was the sound of my vindication. The sound of a world that refused to listen, finally forced to hear the consequences. But let's back up a little before I go further with today's story. Before everything changed, I had worked tirelessly at the shipyard. Frank Miller, the foreman, had a firm grasp on the reins of our daily grind. I'd been loyal. I had followed the rules, all the safety protocols that had been drilled into me over the years, and yet, I had been fired for doing the right thing. Fired for insubordination. That was the charge. My mistake? I refused to do hot work near an unpurged fuel tank. That tank empty, Frank said, decommissioned. But I knew better. I knew the danger that was there, the danger that a small spark could unleash. Frank didn't care. The deadline was more important to him than the lives at stake. The day had started like any other, but by 11:04 a.m., my life had been upended. Frank's dismissive attitude during our exchange still echoed in my ears. "Welder men don't refuse hot work," he had said. He didn't just give me an order, he handed me a death sentence. I tried to argue, tried to lay out the dangers, but he was having none of it. His pride was bigger than the safety manuals we were supposed to follow. In that moment, it became clear to me. This wasn't just a job. It was a test of character, a test of integrity. And I was passing, even if it cost me my livelihood. But that afternoon, a vibration ran through the ground, a deep thump like a heavy weight dropping from above. My instincts kicked in. I hadn't just heard something. I had felt it. The deep rattle of impending disaster. My stomach churned as I walked to the window and looked out. The sky was clear, blue with wisps of white clouds. Nothing to suggest that the world was about to shake beneath my feet. And then my phone buzzed. A simple text from a buddy. "You feel that?" I hurried to the news. The images that flashed across the screen made my blood run cold. Black smoke rising from the shipyard, thick and violent. The air was thick with danger. A catastrophic explosion. The shockwave hit me harder than anything Frank's words had. The sickening truth hit me just as the camera zoomed in. The source of the explosion, Dry Dock 4, the Sea Serpent. My crew. The same crew I had tried to protect. My worst fear was confirmed. The tank had been ignited, and the men I had worked with, some of them, at least were now caught in the inferno. I had been right, and it felt like a punch to the gut. The worst part wasn't the explosion itself, it was the aftermath. The fire was contained, but at what cost? Casualties were reported, and though they couldn't confirm exact numbers, my stomach twisted at the thought of who might be trapped in that blaze. I watched, helpless, as the news anchor gave a grim update. The scale of the disaster was immense. It wasn't just the shipyard that would feel the sting. It would ripple across the entire community. And yet, the thought that gnawed at me the most was that this could have been prevented. But then came a phone call that offered a glimpse of justice. The voice on the other end of the line was Maria Sanchez from OSHA. She was investigating the explosion, and when she mentioned my name, I knew this wasn't just a regular follow-up. She already knew the truth. The fuel tank, Frank's negligence, the lack of a proper purge. She didn't accuse me of anything. Instead, she simply asked for my side of the story. I agreed to meet with her, and we arranged a time to talk. The meeting was intense, but there was a clarity to it. As I recounted the events of that morning, the confrontation with Frank, the threats, the refusal to listen, I felt something I hadn't in hours. Relief. Someone finally was listening. It wasn't just my word against Frank's. This was now a matter of record, a legal document. The truth would come out. I had done everything by the book. I was the one who had spoken up when no one else would. And now I had a voice, a platform where my side of the story would be heard. Maria listened intently as I described the entire sequence of events, from my arrival at the shipyard to the heated argument with Frank, all the way to my firing. She scribbled down notes, asking clarifying questions when needed. She already knew Frank's version of events, but now she had mine. And when I handed over my Firewatch certification, the weight of it felt heavier than before. This wasn't just a piece of paper. It was the key to my integrity. The days after my statement were a blur of interviews and legal jargon, but in the midst of it all, Maria remained my anchor, guiding me through each step. Then, 2 days later, she gave me the news that would change everything. Frank had assigned a new hire to the job. A young kid, fresh out of trade school, someone with no Firewatch certification. He wasn't equipped to handle the situation, and when the explosion occurred, he was the one who ignited the tank. The official investigation confirmed it. Frank had sent that kid to light the fuse on a bomb. And now, the lives of 4 men were lost. 4 fatalities. One of them was David Chen. David, the seasoned welder who had been too afraid to speak up, had paid the ultimate price for his silence. It hit me like a physical blow. David had been one of the men I'd tried to protect. His compliance, his silence, had cost him everything. As for Frank, the consequences were swift and severe. He was arrested, charged with 4 counts of involuntary manslaughter, reckless endangerment, and multiple federal violations. His arrogance had caught up with him. The swagger, the bravado, had evaporated. The man who had once ruled the shipyard with his iron fist was now reduced to a hollow shell of his former self. And so, the system worked. Justice was served, but it came at a terrible cost. The 4 men who had died didn't get to see the justice we had fought for. The families they left behind would never get them back. And in the end, all I felt was the weight of loss. The weight of knowing that, despite everything, I had been powerless to save them from the culture of recklessness that had consumed the shipyard. Months later, I found myself at a new company, working with a foreman who actually valued safety. The pay was better, the work was cleaner, and the environment was worlds apart from what I had left behind. The scars from that day would never fade, but they had become a part of who I was, a reminder of the price of integrity, and the even higher price of ignoring it. There's a lesson in this. Integrity isn't about being loud or making a scene. It's about standing your ground when everything around you tells you to back down. It's about saying no when everyone else is saying yes. And sometimes that means standing alone. But standing alone is far better than standing in the wrong. Message 3. You said Teep took. Message 4. ChatGPT said, as I adjusted to my new life, the memory of the explosion at Port Hamilton never quite faded. It was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, reminding me of the price that was paid for a culture of negligence. But now, I had a new focus, a new purpose. I had found a job with a smaller company, one that was dedicated to building components for offshore wind turbines. The work was cleaner, the pay was better, and the atmosphere was a complete shift from the toxic environment I had left behind. Carlos, my new foreman, had heard my story through the industry grapevine. When we sat down for the interview, he made it clear that he wanted someone who could enforce safety without hesitation, someone who could speak up when things weren't right. We need people like you, he had said, his eyes steady and sincere. People who do it right every time. For the first time in a long while, I felt respected. I wasn't just another worker. I was someone who could make a real difference in the safety of my colleagues. The project we were working on was a massive one, a support column for a turbine. It was complex, with high-stakes consequences if something went wrong. But this time, I wasn't standing alone. I had a team that trusted me, that valued my experience and my commitment to safety. Carlos made it clear. Your call is final, he said, handing me the responsibility for overseeing all hot work protocols. There were no exceptions. If I saw something I didn't like, I had the authority to stop the work. That kind of trust was a rarity, but it was a foundation I could build on. As I sat down at the table with the blueprint, reviewing each weld plan with a meticulous eye, I realized something. The explosion at Port Hamilton had shaped me in ways I hadn't fully understood until now. It had forced me to understand the true cost of silence, the consequences of ignoring the warning signs. But it had also solidified my resolve. I would never again allow myself to be complicit in negligence, no matter the pressure. The weight of responsibility felt heavier, but in a way, it felt right. It was the weight of knowing that I was now part of a culture that valued life over profit, safety over deadlines. I made my first check mark on the blueprint, signaling my approval of the initial phase. The team looked at me with respect, understanding that my decision wasn't just a rule, it was a shield for their safety. It wasn't about being a hero. It was about doing the job right, Every single time. There was no room for compromise. And in that moment, I realized how far I had come. From the fire of the shipyard to the cool professionalism of my new role, I had become the kind of welderman Frank Miller could never understand. Integrity wasn't just a principle anymore. It was my foundation, the core of who I was as a professional. It wasn't something I flaunted. It was something I lived by every day. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by a team that believed in the same values, I knew I had made the right choice. I had walked away from the wreckage of the past, and now, I was building something better, something that would last. But the scars would remain. They had to. They served as a reminder, not of the pain, but of the lesson learned. The lesson that integrity is not about grand gestures or loud declarations. It's about doing the right thing, even when no one is watching. It's about standing firm in the face of danger, and it's about protecting the people around you, even when it costs you everything. That's the true test of character. Months passed, and life began to settle into a routine I could live with. But the ripple effect of the events at Port Hamilton hadn't just changed my job, it had changed me. I looked at things differently now, with a deeper sense of responsibility, a sharper awareness of the dangers that lurked in the shadows. It wasn't just about welding anymore. It wasn't just about the work. It was about making sure everyone went home safe at the end of the day. That was the job, the real job. At the new company, there was a shared sense of commitment to safety. It wasn't just something we talked about, it was woven into the fabric of every operation. When I looked at the new project we were taking on, I saw more than just a set of blueprints. I saw lives, the integrity of the structure, the consequences of even the smallest mistake. We were building something that could last for decades, and I had to make sure that when that turbine turned, it wasn't the result of cutting corners or neglecting the basics. One afternoon, as I reviewed a weld plan, I got a message from an old friend, a former coworker who had been there the day I was fired. It was a simple message, but the weight of it hit me hard. "You were right, man. You were the only one who saw it. We all know it now, but it's too late." I didn't respond. What could I say? What could anyone say? The damage had been done. The lives lost couldn't be brought back. The wreckage of the shipyard couldn't be undone. The disaster that had unfolded was a result of years of built-up negligence, a culture that had prioritized speed over safety. And now, it had claimed more than just the lives of 4 men. It had taken something more. It had shattered any illusions I had about how easily people would fall in line when confronted with the truth. But even in the face of that despair, there was something I clung to, a small seed of hope. The investigation into the explosion had shaken the foundations of that shipyard. OSHA's findings had led to charges being pressed against Frank Miller, the foreman who had dismissed safety as a mere inconvenience. His world had crumbled, but the damage was already done. There was a certain kind of justice in seeing him led away in handcuffs, stripped of his arrogance and pride. The news clips showed his face pale, a man undone by his own recklessness. But the real justice, I realized, wouldn't come from seeing him locked up or humiliated in the media. The real justice would be in the lessons learned, in the changes that would come to the industry. The safety protocols that had been ignored for so long would now have a voice, a new power that no one could dismiss. And while it was a hard truth to swallow, it was the truth I had fought for. As for me, I continued on, doing the job I loved, but now with a new sense of purpose. I wasn't just a welder. I wasn't just a guy following orders. I was a professional, someone who had seen firsthand the consequences of neglect, and who now carried the weight of that knowledge with him. Every weld, every decision I made, was a step toward building a safer future. But I didn't forget. I couldn't. The memories of the explosion, the faces of the men I had worked with, were always there, tucked away in the back of my mind. They were the foundation of my integrity, the reason I fought to make sure no one else had to pay the price I did. In the end, the lesson was simple, but powerful. Integrity isn't always a loud, dramatic stand. Sometimes, it's quiet. Sometimes, it's just doing the right thing when no one else will. And sometimes, it costs you everything. But when you stand firm, when you refuse to compromise on what you know is right, you may just save someone else's life. That's the kind of victory that matters. The shipyard may have been a place of destruction, but I was rebuilding, piece by piece, with every decision, every plan, and every moment I stood my ground. The future was still ahead of me, and now, it was a future I could walk into with my head held high, knowing that I had done everything I could to protect those who relied on me. Weeks went by, and the quiet hum of the wind turbine project became my new rhythm. Every weld, every inspection, and every safety check was done with the same careful precision I had fought so hard to protect. It wasn't just about doing the job anymore, it was about honoring the lives that had been lost. The work was no longer just a means to an end. It was a sacred responsibility to ensure that what happened at Port Hamilton never happened again. But it wasn't always easy. There were days when the weight of what I had witnessed seemed almost too much to bear. The explosions, the lives lost, the friends left behind, they haunted me. Not in loud, intrusive ways, but in quiet moments when I'd sit alone in my truck or stare out at the ocean. They were memories I couldn't escape, and sometimes I wasn't sure if I even wanted to. They served as a constant reminder of the stakes. I'd become the guy people turned to for answers. The one who had been there, who had seen the consequences of ignoring safety, of placing profits over people. And while I knew that what I was doing now was important, it often felt like it would never truly be enough to balance out the tragedy. The loss of 4 lives could never be undone, no matter how many safety checks I signed off on, no matter how much better the work environment was here. Carlos, the foreman who had brought me in, often told me that the work I was doing was making a real difference. "You're the kind of guy who saves lives without making a fuss about it," he would say, usually as he patted me on the back after another long day. But sometimes, his words felt empty, like something he was saying to fill the silence rather than out of real understanding. He wasn't the one who had watched his friends die. He hadn't been there when Frank had ordered us to ignore every safety rule we'd learned. He didn't know what it was like to stand on the edge of a decision that could kill people, and to stand firm in your refusal to follow orders. And yet, despite my misgivings, there was one thing I had learned from all of it. We are not defined by our failures, but by how we handle them. The pain, the grief, and the anger that came from the explosion at Port Hamilton were all part of my story, but they didn't define me. It was how I moved forward, how I took what happened and channeled it into making a difference that shaped who I was becoming. Every morning, as I walked onto the site, I reminded myself of that. The ghosts of the past would always be there, but I was stronger now. The foundation I had built for myself on integrity, on standing up for what was right, was unshakable. I was a professional, and I would make sure that the work we did here was done right. Not just because it was my job, but because it was my duty. The new project we were working on was huge. The offshore turbines were not only a vital part of the company's growth, but they were also a symbol of how far I had come. When the first support column was completed, and I signed off on the final inspection, I felt something I hadn't in a long time: pride. Not in the job itself, but in knowing that we were doing things the right way. No corners cut. No safety rules ignored. Just honest, hard work done safely. But even then, I knew the true test wasn't in how well we followed procedures. The true test was in how we faced the challenges that lay ahead. The world would throw more obstacles in our way, and there would always be temptations to cut corners, to skip steps to meet deadlines. But I had learned the cost of those shortcuts. I had learned the hard way that integrity could never be compromised. As the months went on, I began to see the change I had hoped for. The safety culture in the company continued to thrive. More workers started to speak up when they saw something wrong. They didn't look to me for approval, they simply followed the example I had set. The ripple effect of my actions, of the stand I had taken all those months ago, had begun to spread. The men I worked with were starting to realize that safety wasn't just a formality, it was the most important thing on the job. And while the memories of Port Hamilton would always be with me, I knew I had done everything I could to honor them, to make sure their deaths weren't in vain, to build something better, something safer, something that would last. There would always be a part of me that wondered what could have been done differently. If I had been able to change Frank's mind, if I had been able to stop the explosion before it happened. But I had done my best, and in the end, that was all I could do. It was enough. The future, now more than ever, felt like it was in my hands. I would continue to do what I had always done, but with a renewed sense of purpose. Not just to weld metal, but to weld the very fabric of safety and integrity into every part of the job. Because in the end, that was the only thing that truly mattered.